Gross domestic product is also known as the GDP. Now, the gross domestic product is basically all recognized goods and services produced in a country. Okay, so goods and services produced. So it's not just, making cars or producing televisions. It's also customer service and all of those things. So goods and services. And then we kind of can figure out our GDP per capita, right? So the gross domestic product, how much goods and services are produced per person? Because, all the countries have different populations, so you got to be able to talk about it in terms of how many people are there in order to really get an idea and be able to compare country to country, because you can't compare country to country if they have different populations. So we have ourselves a table. We're going to do Australia together, and I'm going to ask you to complete the table on your own. So to find GDP per capita, right, that means that the GDP goes on top, people go on the bottom. And note that the GDP is in billions, billion means 9, population is in millions, million means 6. So for Australia, we've got the GDP, 1,532 billion, so that's 10 to the 9th, over the population of 22 million, so that's times 10 to the 6th. So when I divide this, I get 1532 divided by 22, and I end up with 69.63636, it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on, times 10 to the 3rd. Well, when we're talking about money, we don't talk about money in terms of scientific notation. So this times 10 to the 3rd, I'm going to move my decimal 3 places to the right. So I end up with a GDP per capita of $69,636.36. And since we're talking about money, I did round to the nearest penny. Okay, and all of these are going to be billions over millions, so you're going to be dealing with the 9 over 6, moving the decimal 3 places for all of them. So I want you to go ahead and hit pause and go to find the GDP per capita for the other 4 countries, and then come back and see if your answers match mine. Okay, so Canada has a GDP per capita of just over 51,000. China's just over 6. Madagascar is at $455 and change. And then the U.S. is a little bit over 51,000. We are going to use this table then to answer some questions. So number 1, which country has the highest GDP, who has the lowest, and then who has the highest GDP per capita and who has the lowest GDP per capita? So, oops, wrong way. So when we're looking at the table, and first question is just GDP. So who has the highest? Well, that's the U.S. They have the highest GDP, and Madagascar has the lowest. All right, well then let's go to the GDP per capita, and you can see that Australia has the highest per capita, and Madagascar also has the lowest. Because when you go to per capita, you've got to then figure in the population. So even though Australia, in terms of actual raw GDP, is not even close to the U.S., they just have so fewer people that when you find the per capita, they have the higher per capita. Okay. Then number 3, China's GDP is more than 4 times the size of Canada's GDP. Okay, so China's GDP is 8,227 compared to Canada. So this is China. And then Canada has 1780. But then when you look at per capita, China's per capita is 6,094, while Canada's is 51, just over 51,000. So why is Canada's GDP per capita so much higher? Well, population, right? China has this many million in population, whereas Canada has 34.9 million. So it's just a huge difference in terms of the number of people. So when you divide the GDP, you end up with just a great difference in per capita. So you have to take into account the population before you start making comparisons. Okay, if China's GDP were proportional to Australia's, what would China's expected GDP be? So we know their per capitas are so different. So if China wanted to have a per capita like Australia's, how much would they have to have total? So we're going to do a little what if, right? We're going to compare China to Australia. And we're going to have the GDP and we're going to have people. Now, I know that we have all of this information already, but we want to play the what if game. So where does the unknown value go? Well, what would China's expected GDP? So China's GDP is the unknown, and everything else we fill in with what we know. So we know that Australia's GDP is 1532. We know that Australia's population is 22. We know that China's population is 1350. Now, we don't have to put in billions or millions because we are being consistent. All GDPs are in billions. All populations are in millions. So as long as you're consistent, you're good. All right, so now we're ready to solve this. So we do our proportion. 22x equals, go in the other direction, 2068200. We divide both sides by 22, and our unknown value is 94,009. And remember, GDPs are in billion. Well, if we would move the decimal point 3 places, that would make it 94 trillion. So China would have to have a total GDP of $94 trillion in order to have a per capita rate like Australia. And remember, the actual, so we would have to have 94,000 billion, and the actual, if you want to keep it in terms of billion, is 8227, or 8 trillion. So it would have to go from 8 trillion to 94 trillion. We're talking an $86 trillion increase if it wanted to be like Australia. That is just absurd, right? That's just never going to happen. All right, so let's play another what if. Let's compare Madagascar to the U.S. So we've got Madagascar, we've got the U.S. We're talking GDP compared to the people. Okay, so the unknown, what would Madagascar's expected GDP? So that's where the unknown goes. We know that the U.S. GDP is 16,244. We know there are 314 million people in the U.S., and there are 21.9 million people in Madagascar. So we're trying to say if Madagascar wanted to produce like the U.S., what would their total GDP have to be? All right, so we cross multiply. So 314x equals big number 355,743.6. It's not too big. We're going to divide both sides by 314. And Madagascar would have to produce roughly, that's not what I wanted there, $1,133 billion a year in order to be able to produce to the same ratio as the U.S. And remember, their actuality is roughly 10 billion. This is the actual. So they have right now 10 billion. They would have to increase that to 1,133 billion to produce like the U.S., right? That is also a very, very large increase if they wanted to do that.